Configuring view roles and permissions. I'm gonna level with you on this one. I've recorded this now, I think 3 separate times, and then I get to a certain point in the permissions model and go, that doesn't make any sense. And it finally took me actually sitting down and drawing it out on a piece of paper before I could finally figure out what VMware View's role-based authentication model is. When you draw it out, okay, admittedly it's got a compelling design, but the implementation of it, is confusing. And so consequently, it makes it seem, I don't know, it makes it seem more challenging than what it really is. A couple of rules as it relates to roles and permissions. A role contains one or more privileges. Now, what's interesting about VMware View's implementation of roles is they are, at least in my awareness, a slightly different interpretation of what a role is in an RBAC model in the first place. And maybe I'm just, maybe I'm just interpreting it incorrectly, but the way I'm thinking of a role and the way the role actually gets implemented in View are a little bit different. So a role contains one or more privileges. A permission contains one or more administrators and groups, then a role, and then a folder. Okay, and then a folder contains one or more pools and desktops or desktops. So this really serves to make things really confusing. Let me help you with so this is what I ended up drawing out before I could finally figure out how things work. And this actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's look at what we're looking at here. In a role-based authentication model, a lot of times we get tripped up because the role tends to be the thing in the role-based authentication model that you spend your time looking at. But in VMware View's RBAC, it's actually the permission is really kind of where all the arrows ultimately point towards. So if you look at permission, a permission will contain one or more administrators and or groups. Okay, these are your Active Directory objects. It will contain one or more roles. Now, in View's RBAC, a role is nothing more than a container for multiple privileges. The privileges, these are the what. Okay, what are you allowed to do? This is the collection of those. So the one role would be person who has the ability, or we'll call them a view-only administrator for View, right? So you have the ability to view things. Another role would be ability to manipulate, so a rewrite administrator. So multiple permissions go into a role. One or more roles go into a permission. Now, also, a folder must go into a permission as well. A folder is made up of one or more pools and desktops. So I have a series of pools. I can put those pools and or those desktops in folders, and then the folders get assigned permissions. Same thing with privileges. One or more privileges get assigned to roles, and those roles get assigned permissions. Same thing with administrators and groups. So this model, just keep this in mind. You might want to just hit the print screen on this, because as I shift into the actual clicking of the buttons, it's this model that you have to keep in mind, because the implementation of the model is really challenging. Okay, so remember this. Here we are inside of the VMware View Administrator. Inside the VMware View Administrator, we are looking at the dashboard. I'm going to go down here to, let's take a look first at pools. And you will see that for one or more pools, okay, the linked clone pool, for example, I can change the folder from one thing to another. Okay, this is actually the view up here. Here's where I would change the folder up here. So if I want to change the linked clones folder to something else, I can do so from right here. I only have one folder, the root folder, right now. Keep that in mind. Because when I come down here to administrators, well, here's where things start to get a little squirrely. And that squirreliness has nothing really to do with the model. Again, the model is sound, it's the implementation. Okay, so at the end of the day, we're looking to get to a permission here. If I go, however, and attempt to add an administrator in a group here, add user group, it's going to ask me for, all right, give me an Active Directory object. All right, I'll punch in a domain here because I want to grab domain admins. When I do that, however, in order to add that, I have to add in the role. Now recall that the role has nothing to do with administrators and groups. This button where it says add user or group, you're actually in the end adding a permission, because it's going to ask for an administrator or group, a role, and a folder. Just check this out. So let's give it a role. I haven't even assigned roles yet. These are the default out-of-the-box roles. So domain admins gets the administrator's role, and then that gets corresponded to the root folder. When I hit the finish button, they're going to appear here. Okay, if I look here under roles, you'll see administrator now appears assigned to the root, and the root now sees the permission associated with administrators. So the button marked add user or group effectively kind of does the same thing as the button marked add permission, except I have to, if it exists here, I can add a permission already. If I hit this button, then I've got to go through the entire process of ultimately creating what is actually a permission. Maddening, absolutely maddening. Same thing happens over here under roles, right? So let's create a role. I'm going to call this my role, for example, and I can go through and add various permissions here. Certain roles are only going to be exposed at certain levels of the tree. If I do not actually have a role that corresponds to something that makes sense for folders, I can't actually see this in any of the folders. I have to come down here and work with some of the items that make sense for folders, like desktops, for example, things that would be in a folder, as opposed to entire view infrastructure privileges. So I select all of these things. I hit OK. All right, there's my role. I can now add a permission, which then links that role. Okay, going back here once again, links that role, the privileges in that role, to the admins and groups, and then to those folders if it's correctly described. So domain, here, there's the find button, there's domain admins, OK. Then for this, I'm going to choose next, there's the folder again, and there's finish. So now I have administrator and group, role, folder equals permission. Over here in folders, right? Add a folder, call it my folder. Oops, my folder here, choose OK. I choose my folder. If I want to add a permission, once again, I'm going to be adding in, okay, there's a domain object. I'm just choosing domain admins here, but domain object roles, my role, because I just created that, and the folder that I created that object on to create the permission. So, again, maddeningly difficult. This implementation is very rough because you would expect this to add the user or group to this item and ultimately create the permission at the end. But no, that add user or group button actually sends you through the entire process to get you all the way to what is effectively a permission at the very end. Again, spend some time with this. I kid you not, print this out, because otherwise you're going to be spinning around trying to figure out what belongs to what. But this is the model as it relates to how you link together administrators and groups, roles, folders, and then lastly, these pools and desktops here, when you take a pool or desktop and assign it to the folder. Okay, hopefully this makes sense to you, because you can spend all kinds of time trying to figure out how this works. You'll see up here under users and groups too, you can actually go about updating user information. Okay, if I hit the update general user information, this will update things like name, phone, email, username, default Windows domain from the items that exist here in users and groups. Okay, the idea is that this would be populated in your Active Directory. And what this is doing is going into your Active Directory and trying to gather, information about these items from Active Directory. Okay, from here I can also find desktops that this thing corresponds to. So right now domain admins are tied to, whatever desktops are linked into domain admins. This is the way that you would go about finding those. Here's the pool entitlement associated with domain admins. I would spend some really quality time here. Again, this whole model here really stands sound, even though the implementation of it is kind of rough. But take a look at this. Ensure that you take your pools and desktops and put them in folders, your privileges, put them into roles, and take these three items and move them into permissions to create what is essentially the role-based authentication model used inside of VMware View. Even more maddening is the fact that none of this has anything to do with entitlements. We talked about entitlements back way early, right? And entitlements are essentially the notion of, I have a pool here, and this pool is entitled to be used by some group of users. And I can add in which users have access to the pool here. So entitlements identify which people can make use of the pool, and the permissions structure, the administrator structure, is what defines who can administer the pool. And those two items are completely separated, at least in this model, at least again as I see it. So be very conscious of that. You're going to spend some time kind of floating around with entitlements and the roles and permissions and folders and all that stuff. Hopefully this will give you, and especially that model is worth the price of admission to at least simplify the situation for you. So very short nugget, but very critically important nugget because of the complexity here. What have we talked about? We have talked about the RBAC model in VMware View. Nice design, nothing wrong with the design, but the implementation is very confusing. I talked a little bit about how roles contain privileges and permissions contain those three different items. Folders contain pools and desktops, and then entitlements sort of stand out to the side. Took a look at how to construct them, how you need to be careful with which buttons you actually push, because certain buttons don't behave probably in the way that you would think. And then ultimately how you can construct all of these things together to create that RBAC model for administering your VMware View infrastructure. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.